They say old age brings wisdom, but no one warned me it would also bring silence, the kind that echoes through an empty house long after the man you love is gone. At 68, I thought loneliness was my heaviest burden until the night my son's wife looked me in the eye and said, "You don't fit my family, leave." And my son Daniel stayed silent beside her. My name is Margaret Collins, and this is the story of how a mother's heart can break and still find the strength to heal. I still wake up at 6 every morning as if Robert were still here beside me. The habit is too deeply ingrained to break. I slip into my robe, shuffle across the creaking floorboards, and head straight for the kitchen. The smell of coffee has always been the first comfort of the day. Without thinking, I measure out enough for 2 cups the way I have done for 40 years. My hands move automatically, steady as ever, but my heart clenches when I reach for the second mug. I pour the steaming coffee into both cups. One for me, one for him. I set his cup down at the end of the kitchen table at the place where he always sat by the window that overlooks the front porch. For a brief moment, my eyes trick me. I almost see him sitting there with his broad shoulders, newspaper folded under one arm, ready to grumble about the headlines. But the chair is empty, and only the rising steam fills the space between us. Robert has been gone since the spring of 2018. A heart attack, the doctors said, too sudden and too strong. He was 69. Even now, nearly 6 years later, the house on Oak Street feels hollow without him. I still expect to hear his boots on the porch after a long day at work, or the sound of his voice calling me Mags, the nickname only he used. Instead, the silence answers me every time. Robert was a construction inspector for the city of Columbus, a plain job by most standards, but he wore it like a badge of honor. He used to say, "If I sign off on it, families can sleep at night under a safe roof." He was proud of that. His hands were rough, his shirts often smelled faintly of sawdust and rain, and I loved him for it. I was the practical one, the numbers woman. He used to tease me whenever I sat hunched over ledgers. "Life isn't just a spreadsheet, Mags. You can't balance every column." I would laugh, swat at him with my pencil, but I never stopped running the numbers. That was who I was, and who he was. Steady, dependable. Kept me believing that the world was in order. Now the house is my ledger, and every room feels like an entry left incomplete. The front porch still has his rocking chair faded and splintering on the arms where his hands rested. In the kitchen, the oak cabinets we saved up to buy together 30 years ago still stand there varnished, dulled by time. Upstairs, the bedroom holds his scent in the old flannel shirts I could never pack away. Even the garage carries his shadow. His worn tool belt still hangs on a hook, waiting for hands that will never reach for it again. I wander through these spaces as if they are pages in a book only I can read. Sometimes at night I run my hand over the armrest of his chair and whisper words I know he can't hear. Other times, I stand at the bedroom window and expect him to walk down Oak Street, head tilted, whistling that tuneless melody he always carried. But the street stays empty, lined with bare trees and quiet houses. Living without Robert has been like walking through fog. At first, the grief came like waves that knocked me flat, stealing my breath. Over time it changed, settled into a quieter ache that moves with me everywhere. People tell you that time heals, but I've learned it doesn't heal. It reshapes. The wound remains, but the edge is dull enough for you to keep moving. This morning, as I sit with my own cup of coffee, I glance across at his untouched one. The steam curls upward, then fades, leaving the surface still and dark. It's such a small thing, that second cup, yet it carries the weight of our entire life together. The ritual comforts me, but it also reminds me of what I've lost. I whisper softly into the stillness. "You'd laugh at me, Robert, keeping this up every morning." My voice sounds too loud in the empty kitchen. There is no answering chuckle, no warm hand reaching across the table. Only silence and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The world outside continues on, of course. Children walk to school, neighbors shovel snow in winter, or rake leaves in fall. I wave, sometimes smile politely, but it feels as though I am behind a pane of glass watching life move on without me. Inside this house, it is always half empty. Half of everything is gone. Half the bed, half the conversation, half the laughter. People say losing a spouse after so many years is like losing a part of yourself. I think it's more than that. It's losing the reflection of who you were. Robert knew me in a way no one else ever will. Without him, I sometimes feel as if I'm fading into the wallpaper, becoming invisible even to myself. I pick up his cup now. It has already cooled the warmth long gone. The bitter scent rises faintly, then disappears. I carry it to the sink, pour the cold coffee down the drain and rinse it out. The water runs clear, but the emptiness in my chest stays. Setting the cup upside down on the rack, I let out a long breath. The morning light filters through the window, catching the dust motes that dance in the air. For a moment, everything is suspended. His absence, my solitude, the quiet of this house that once held so much life. I sit back down, cradle my own cup between my hands, and stare at the empty chair across from me. The second mug rests on the rack, clean and unused, waiting for a tomorrow that will never come. And that is when the weight presses hardest, when I realize that losing one person means losing an entire world you built together. I sip my coffee slowly, tasting the bitterness, letting it remind me that I am still here, even if he is not. Daniel wasn't always the man he is now. When I close my eyes, I still see the little boy who used to curl up beside me on the couch, asking for one more story before bed. He loved books about explorers and faraway places, and I'd read aloud until my voice grew hoarse. Robert would come in from the porch, smelling of the outdoors, and say, "Bedtime, champ," but Daniel would plead, "Just one more chapter, Dad." He was gentle, thoughtful, the kind of child who noticed when the neighbor's cat looked hungry and carried out a saucer of milk. Robert adored taking him fishing on Saturday mornings. I'd pack sandwiches and thermoses, and they'd come home sunburned and happy. Daniel clutching a bucket with a single fish like it was treasure. Those days feel like a different lifetime. We built our lives around giving him every chance we never had. I took overtime shifts, balanced every budget down to the penny while Robert worked weekends all so Daniel could have the things we only dreamed of at his age. I still remember the look on his face when we surprised him with a used Honda Civic for his 18th birthday. His eyes shone like the headlights as he wrapped his arms around both of us. "I'll never forget what you've done for me," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. We believed him. We believed that gratitude would carry through the years. We believed wrong. After Robert passed in 2018, I thought grief might bring Daniel closer, that he would step into the role of support and comfort. But within a year, Isabella came into his life. By the time they married in 2019, I could already see the changes. He began talking about networking events, golf outings with people from work dinners at trendy restaurants where the menu was more French than English. He wore suits tailored so sharply that the boy who used to fish off the Scioto riverbank seemed to vanish. Isabella herself is striking, I won't deny it. She's 35 now, with dark hair always pulled back into a sleek bun, heels that click like punctuation with every step. She works as a program coordinator for the city, and she makes sure everyone knows it. At family gatherings, what few there were, she'd slip remarks into conversation, little barbs coated in sugar. "Vintage," she once said, glancing around my living room. "It's so authentic, just like something from a magazine spread." But I could see the contempt behind her smile. To her, everything I had built was out of date, too plain, too small town for the world she envisioned. Daniel absorbed her values like a sponge. Suddenly, his conversations were filled with names of colleagues, bosses, city officials. He spoke less of old friends, less of family memories. He started measuring success by the car in your driveway or the neighborhood where your house stood. I tried to remind myself that young couples build their own lives, but it hurt to watch him drift further into her orbit, leaving behind the parts of himself I thought were unshakable. The memory that cuts deepest came on my birthday in 2020. It was the first one after Robert's death, and I had quietly hoped Daniel might make it special, might show me that family still mattered. The day passed without a call. Late in the evening, my phone buzzed with a simple text. "Happy birthday, Mom." No phone call, no visit. Just those 3 words on a glowing screen. I sat at the kitchen table with a small cake I'd bought myself from Kroger. A single candle flickered in the dim light. I closed my eyes and leaned forward, the wax dripping onto the frosting. And I made a wish I knew couldn't come true. That Robert would walk through the door, or that Daniel would knock and say, "Surprise," I remembered. Instead, there was only silence. When I blew out the candle, I remembered a night when Daniel was about 8 years old. We had been sitting in his room, the glow of his nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall. Out of nowhere, he had grabbed my hand and said, "Mom, I'll never leave you. I'll always take care of you, even when I'm big." The memory stabbed through me as I watched the smoke curl upward from the extinguished flame. That boy's promise seemed lost, buried under designer suits and Isabella's sharp smile. I ate a slice of cake alone, the sweetness turning bitter in my mouth. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock marking the emptiness of the evening. I washed the plate, set it back in the cabinet, and tucked the rest of the cake away. No laughter, no candles blown out by eager breaths, no sun to hug me goodnight. Just me, the quiet walls, and the echo of a promise a little boy once made. The silence that night wasn't new, but it was the first time I admitted to myself that Daniel had changed into someone I didn't recognize, someone I wasn't sure I could ever reach again. After Robert's funeral, the house felt unbearably still, and the quiet pressed in on me from every corner. I knew I couldn't let myself sink too deeply into that silence. Practical as always, I turned to the numbers. I sat at the kitchen table one evening with a yellow legal pad, a calculator, and the paperwork from the insurance company. $280,000. A number both comforting and frightening. Comforting because it meant I wouldn't starve or lose the house, frightening because it was finite, a sum that could vanish faster than I wanted to admit if I wasn't careful. I went through scenarios the way I'd been trained to do as an accountant. Certificates of deposit, annuities, conservative stocks. I knew all the safe options, the ones widows my age usually chose. But the thought of sitting alone in my house, simply eking out the years until the money ran dry, filled me with dread. I needed purpose. I needed something to throw myself into, something more than morning coffee and endless days of emptiness. That's when Oliver Bennett came to mind. Oliver was 71, a man I'd worked for years earlier when I handled the books for his small chain of restaurants. He owned a place downtown called the Maple Oak. It had charm, but charm doesn't pay the bills. I'd seen his ledgers more than once, noticed the sloppy ordering, the staff turnover, the lack of marketing. I remembered telling him years ago, "Oliver, you've got good bones here, but you're bleeding money in all the wrong places." He just chuckled, saying he wasn't a numbers man. So when I heard through an old colleague that Oliver was looking to sell something, inside me stirred. I called him, my voice steady even as my heart raced. "Oliver, I heard you're thinking of letting Maple Oak go." He sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years of frustration. "I don't have the energy anymore, Margaret. It's been in the red 3 years straight. I just can't keep it afloat." We met at the restaurant a week later. I walked through the front doors into the warm wood-paneled dining room, the smell of stale fryer oil lingering in the air. The place was tired, but I could still see the potential. The old brick walls, the cozy booths, the way the late afternoon sun spilled across the tables. It could shine again with the right hands. Over coffee, Oliver leaned back. "You're serious about this? At your age, after losing Robert, you want to run a restaurant?" "Exactly because of that," I answered. "I can't sit in that house waiting for the days to pass." "I know numbers, Oliver. I know where you went wrong, and I know how to fix it. Give me the chance." The contract was signed in May of 2019. I wrote the check, my hand shaking only slightly, and when it was done, I felt something spark inside me. I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The first months were brutal. I pored over every line of the books late into the night, finding leaks like a detective chasing clues. I renegotiated supplier contracts, cut waste, and insisted on accountability. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets, but the numbers finally began to align. I knew the food would have to be the soul of the place, so I set out to find someone who could deliver. That's when I met Elias Grant. 31 tall, with sleeves rolled up and the energy of someone hungry to prove himself. He had been working as a sous chef in a larger restaurant buried under hierarchy, his talent unnoticed. During our interview, he spoke with passion about flavors, about reimagining seasonal dishes. "I don't just want to cook," he told me. "I want to build something. If you give me the freedom, I'll give you everything I have." Something in his determination mirrored my own. I hired him on the spot. We set to work together. He experimented in the kitchen. I adjusted the balance sheets, and slowly, Maple Oak began to change. We swapped out the dated menu for dishes with warmth and creativity. Pumpkin ravioli in the fall, braised short ribs that melted on the tongue, fresh salads with local produce. I created a new accounting system that tracked every cost, every margin. Elias and I would sit at a corner table after closing him with a notepad full of recipes, me with my calculator, and we would plan. By the end of that year, I began to notice the change in the air. The dining room, once half empty, started to fill. Couples came in for anniversaries, families for birthdays, co-workers for lunch breaks. The chatter and laughter returned, echoing against the brick walls like a long-lost song. I kept my ownership quiet. To the staff and customers, I was just an older woman who liked to stop by sometimes with a book in hand, sometimes with a kind word. Only Elias and my manager Raymond knew the truth. There was power in anonymity. It allowed me to observe, to listen, to savor the transformation without the weight of anyone's expectations. I remember the night we reopened officially after renovations and menu changes. The booths gleamed, the scent of fresh herbs and roasted meat filled the air, and the front door swung open with a flood of customers. Every table was taken. From my seat in the corner, I watched a young couple clink glasses, an older man laugh with his grandchildren, a group of co-workers share appetizers. For a moment, I forgot I was Margaret the widow. I wasn't the woman left behind sitting in a silent house with 2 cups of coffee. I was a woman who had built something new, who had taken risk and turned it into life. My heart swelled with pride as I sipped my water and pretended to be just another guest. The buzz of voices wrapped around me and I closed my eyes, letting the sound sink in. It felt like breath returning to lungs that had been empty too long. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt alive again. The months that followed the reopening were some of the most exhausting and rewarding of my life. I spent more time at Maple Oak than I did in my own house, and strangely it felt less lonely there. The restaurant buzzed with life, and in that hum I found a kind of family I hadn't realized I needed. Raymond Hayes, my manager, was a steady presence. At 42 with a teenage son at home, he carried a quiet discipline that balanced the chaos of a restaurant floor. Cho. He had a habit of walking the dining room with a small notepad jotting down the smallest details. A wobbly table leg, a flickering candle the way a waiter set down a plate. The details make the difference, he told me once. I could tell he believed it as deeply as I believed in numbers. Then there was Elias, my young chef with a restless spirit. Every day he seemed to come in with a new idea scribbled on scraps of paper. "What if we try a rosemary reduction instead of sage?" he'd say, eyes lit up like a boy showing off a science project. I watched him in the kitchen. Sleeves rolled high, flour dusting his forearm, directing the line with energy that made even the laziest prep cook stand taller. His passion fed me in ways I hadn't expected. On the floor, Kira Lopez, our hostess, seemed to sparkle. At 26, she was quick with a smile, quicker with a sharp word when anyone stepped out of line. She had a way of making even the most impatient guests feel seen, as if she'd been waiting all day just for them. More than once, I stood by the door watching her weave through the crowd, thinking how Robert would have admired her determination. And then Brandon Miller, one of our servers, earnest and kind, always carrying himself with the politeness of someone raised to say ma'am and sir no matter who he addressed. He was 28, still paying off student loans, working double shifts, but he never complained. Once, when I slipped him a few extra dollars for his hard work, he shook his head. "No need, Mrs. Collins. I'm just glad to have a job that feels like family." That word family struck me deeper than he realized. I rarely announced myself as the owner. To most, I was just the older woman who came around to check on things, sometimes sitting quietly at a corner table with a cup of tea, sometimes asking how the night was going. I liked it that way. It let me observe without pretense, gave me the freedom to savor the life blooming around me. I wasn't invisible here. I was part of the rhythm, even if no one quite knew my role. One evening during a particularly busy Friday, I stood near the host stand as guests streamed in. Kira rushed past me, balancing menus, her headset askew. She stopped just long enough to grin. "Move out of the way, Grandma, or you'll get trampled." The word caught me off guard. "Grandma." For a heartbeat, I almost bristled, but the warmth in her voice melted the sting. She didn't mean it as an insult. She meant it as affection, a label that tethered me to something larger than myself. My chest tightened, but this time with gratitude. Later that night, when the last table had cleared, I found Kira wiping down menus. "You called me Grandma," I said, half teasing. She looked up, cheeks flushing. "Oh gosh, I didn't mean anything by it. You feel like family here. Everyone trusts you." I smiled, touched more than I wanted to admit. "Don't apologize. It was the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time." Moments like that made the long days worth it. Elias, too, had a way of reminding me what we were building. After a long shift, he'd often collapse into a chair across from me, sweaty and tired, yet his eyes still alive with ideas. One night, as we picked at leftover dessert samples, he leaned forward. "You know, Margaret, you're kind of my proof. If you can start all this at 68 after everything, then maybe I don't have to be so scared about chasing my own dream." I stared at him, fork paused midair. "Your dream?" "Yeah," he said, sheepish. "Someday I want my own place. A small bistro, maybe? Nothing fancy. But sometimes I worry it's too late already, like I missed my shot. And then I see you." He gestured around the empty dining room, the polished wood, the soft lamplight. "And I think maybe it's never too late." His words sank into me, stirring something I hadn't expected. I had been so wrapped up in my own survival that I hadn't realized others were watching, drawing courage from me. For years I'd thought my worth ended with Robert, with raising Daniel, with the ledgers I kept. But here was this young man, seeing me as proof that life could still bloom after loss. I laughed softly, setting down my fork. "Then promise me one thing, Elias. When the time comes, don't let fear talk you out of it." He smiled, a boyish grin full of hope. "Deal." That night, as I locked up and stepped into the cool Columbus air, I felt lighter. The restaurant wasn't just saving me. It was giving others a reason to dream. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. Not because of blood ties or obligations, but because of the family we chose to build inside those brick walls. It was early January of 2024 when my phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. I dried my hands on a dish towel and picked it up, expecting a weather alert or maybe a message from the library about a book I'd reserved. Instead, it was from Daniel. "Mom, our 5th anniversary dinner. 7 p.m. Maple Oak. Reservation under Collins. Please confirm." I must have read it 3 times before it sank in. Maple Oak. My restaurant. The one I had rebuilt with my own hands and sleepless nights, the one he had never once asked me about. Of all the places in Columbus, my son had chosen this one, without realizing who signed the checks, who kept the doors open, who had given it life again. My heart thudded with a strange mix of irony and pain. I could almost hear Robert chuckling in disbelief if he were still alive. I set the phone down and pressed both palms against the counter. Should I tell him? Should I text back? "Funny choice, son, you picked my place?" Or should I let it play out? I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. A voice in me whispered, "Don't say a word. Let them show themselves. For once, don't cushion the truth for him." I typed out a simple, "Yes, I'll be there." Then I placed the phone face down and leaned back in my chair, the decision settling like a stone in my chest. The days leading up to Friday felt heavier than usual. Each time I stopped by Maple Oak to review invoices or talk to Elias about menu updates, I pictured Daniel and Isabella sitting at one of those tables laughing with their glasses of wine, oblivious to the fact that every detail around them, the flicker of the candles, the polish of the glasses, the food on their plates, was my doing. When doubt crept in, I pushed it aside. I had played small too long, hidden too long. Now I would simply wait and watch. On Thursday, I decided it was time to prepare. I hadn't bought a new dress in years. Most of my clothes came in brown boxes from online orders, safe, sensible elastic waistbands and muted colors. But that afternoon, I drove to the mall in Easton, parked near Macy's, and stepped inside with more nerves than I expected. I combed through racks of dresses until my fingers landed on one made of navy blue fabric with a soft shimmer. It had long sleeves, an elegant neckline, and the kind of quiet sophistication I hadn't felt in decades. I carried it into the fitting room and slipped it over my shoulders. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. The lines on my face were still there, the silver strands of hair the years etched into my skin, but the dress seemed to lift me, to remind me I was still a woman, not just a widow, not just a mother cast aside. A saleswoman about my age smiled when I stepped out. "That color suits you. Navy always carries grace." Her words warmed me more than I wanted to admit. I bought the dress along with a new pair of low-heeled shoes and a clutch purse. The next morning, I went to see Sophia Martinez, the stylist I'd trusted for years, but always asked only for simple trims. When I sat in her chair, she combed through my gray hair and asked, "Something special?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. My son and his wife invited me to dinner. I want to look put together." She smiled knowingly. "Say no more." She snipped and styled, curling the strands into soft waves, brushing them back in a way that framed my face. When she turned me toward the mirror, I blinked at the reflection. I looked lighter, younger. Not by years, but by spirit. "Beautiful," Sophia said, draping the cape away. "Robert would approve." The mention of his name caught me off guard, but instead of tears, I felt a steady calm. At home, I opened my jewelry box and pulled out the sapphire necklace Robert had given me on our 30th anniversary. I hadn't worn it since his funeral. The silver chain lay cool against my skin, the deep blue stone resting just above my collarbone. I touched it with my fingertips, remembering the night he gave it to me at a little Italian restaurant downtown. His hands had trembled as he passed me the box, his eyes full of love. 30 years, Mags, he'd said then, and I'd do it all again. Now 5 years without him, I clasped the necklace and whispered into the quiet room, "Give me strength tomorrow." On Friday evening, as I stood in front of the mirror, dressed and ready, I barely recognized myself. The navy dress hugged me in all the right ways, the necklace caught the light. My hair shimmered softly under the lamp. For the first time in years, I didn't look like a woman defined by loss. I looked like someone stepping back into her own life. I lingered there, staring into my own eyes, hardly blinking. The silence of the house didn't press on me as harshly this time. Instead, it felt like a pause before a storm, the kind of stillness that comes when something significant is about to unfold. I picked up my clutch slid on my coat and took one last look at the woman in the mirror. For a moment, I smiled. It had been so long since I'd seen that reflection staring back at me. The morning of the dinner, I drove downtown earlier than usual, the streets still quiet with the kind of January chill that cuts through even the thickest coat. Maple Oak stood proud on the corner, its brick facade glowing faintly under the pale winter sun. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of wood polish and the faint trace of last night's roasted garlic still clinging to the air. Raymond was already there, as I knew he would be. He looked up from his clipboard when I entered, his expression reassuring. "Mrs. Collins, the table's been set aside in the back corner like you requested. The staff's been briefed. No one will slip, I promise." "Thank you, Raymond," I said, touched by his steady tone. "It's important that tonight feels like any other evening for them." He gave me a half smile, the kind of smile of a man who understood family complications better than he cared to admit. He had told me once that he and his own father hadn't spoken in years. Perhaps that was why he always treated me with an extra measure of respect. I walked through the dining room, running my hand lightly along the edge of a polished booth, straightening a candle that leaned slightly askew. Everything looked perfect, warm, inviting the way I had envisioned when I first signed the papers years ago. In the kitchen, Elias was bustling already, sleeves rolled high, his energy filling the space. He stopped when he saw me wiping his hands on a towel. "Mrs. Collins, I was thinking about preparing something special just for your table tonight. Maybe the duck confit. It would show well." I shook my head firmly. "No, Elias. Treat them like every other guest. That's important to me." His brow furrowed. "But wouldn't you want to show them?" "I want them to see Maple Oak as it is," I cut in gently. "Not polished, not curated just for their benefit. Let them taste what everyone else tastes." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, the regular menu it is. But I'll make sure it's flawless." "I know you will," I said, giving him a small smile before stepping back out into the quiet of the front room. As I lingered near the door, it swung open, and in walked Donald Avery, his scarf still dusted with cold. He spotted me instantly, and his face lit up in the kind of smile that reached the eyes. "Margaret, I was hoping I'd find you here. I stopped by for a quick lunch, but I see you're already inspecting every corner." "I can't help it," I replied. "Old habits." He chuckled, setting his leather gloves on the host stand. Donald had a way of making conversation feel effortless, as if we'd known each other for decades instead of a handful of months. "The library's hosting a reading circle next week," he said, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "They're covering Frost and Dickinson. Would you care to come?" "It's on Thursday evening. I could save you a seat." I blinked, surprised by the warmth that welled up inside me at the invitation. "That sounds lovely. It's been a long time since I went to something like that." "Then it's settled," he said, picking up his gloves again. "I'll look forward to it." He gave me a little bow, half playful, before heading toward the hostess stand to request his table. I stood there longer than I should have, a little stunned by the simple kindness of being asked, of being included in something outside of obligation or pity. It reminded me that connection can still happen even this late in life, and not just within the boundaries of family. By midday, I returned home, the weight of the evening pressing more heavily on me with each passing hour. I walked into the living room, the light pale and gray through the curtains, and sat down in front of the mantel. The photographs lined up in their frames seemed to watch me, Robert in his work jacket smiling with sawdust in his hair, Daniel at 10 holding up a lopsided fish with pride, the three of us together on the porch one summer. Robert's arms slung around my shoulders, Daniel leaning into me with the careless affection of a boy who hadn't yet learned to measure love against ambition. I picked up the photo from Daniel's high school graduation. Robert had nearly burst with pride that day, his hand gripping mine so tight when Daniel took his diploma. I remembered how Daniel had run over afterward, pulling us into a hug and whispering, "I couldn't have done it without you two." That memory felt almost like a cruel echo now. The clock ticked softly in the background as I set the frame down. My stomach tightened at the thought of tonight, of Isabella's sharp eyes, of Daniel's silence. But then I caught my reflection in the glass of the picture frame. The navy dress, the sapphire necklace I'd laid out on the bed upstairs waiting for me. And something inside me steadied. I rose from the chair, crossed the room, and looked into the hallway mirror. My eyes were tired, yes, but clear. I touched the silver chain at my neck, rehearsed the words in my mind, not to them, but to myself. Tonight, I will not be silent. The glow of the restaurant lights spilled onto the sidewalk as I stepped out of the cab, my breath catching in the cold January air. Inside, Maple Oak pulsed with warmth, low jazz floating from the speakers, the hum of conversation glasses clinking softly. For a moment I paused at the door, steadying myself before I handed my coat to Kira. She greeted me with her usual bright smile, though her eyes carried the quick flicker of recognition. Without a word, she gestured toward the back corner. Daniel and Isabella were already seated. Daniel stood awkwardly adjusting his tie before giving me a half-hearted hug that felt more like an obligation than a greeting. "Mom," he murmured the word flat as if he were announcing me rather than welcoming me. Isabella stayed in her seat, lips curving into a tight smile. "Margaret, you made it. Thank you for joining us." Her tone suggested she had done me a favor by including me. I slid into the chair across from them, smoothing the skirt of my navy dress, feeling the sapphire necklace cool against my skin. Kira placed menus in front of us, but before I could speak, Isabella tapped the wine list with one manicured finger. "We've already ordered a Cabernet. It's an excellent year. But of course," she added with a dismissive tilt of her head, "everyone has their own preferences." "I'll have a glass of Chardonnay," I said evenly, meeting Kira's eyes. She nodded, scribbled, and hurried off. Isabella raised her brow as if to say I had no palate for sophistication. The conversation began, as it always did with her, centered on Isabella. She leaned forward, her cream silk blouse, pristine, her bracelets catching the light as she spoke with practiced ease. "The City Hall project has been all-consuming. We've been coordinating with officials from multiple departments. My boss says it could be a model for other cities." Daniel nodded dutifully, eyes on her as though she were the sun. "It's a big deal," he added softly. Then fell silent again. Isabella smiled at him approvingly before turning back to me. "It's the kind of work that elevates your circle, you know. Important contacts, important responsibilities. It takes a lot of energy, but it's worth it when you're moving forward." I sipped my water and let the words wash over me. I had spent decades keeping ledgers balanced, raising her husband, making sacrifices she couldn't begin to imagine, yet somehow I was the one painted as outdated, unimportant. She pressed on. "We're looking at houses now. It's time. The condo was fine for starting out, but we need something that reflects who we are now. There's a neighborhood in Upper Arlington we've been eyeing. Tree-lined streets, the right kind of neighbors. Families who understand what it means to maintain standards." Daniel nodded again, his face unreadable. I turned to him, searching for some glimmer of the boy who once believed kindness mattered more than status. But his gaze skittered away, landing on the condensation of his wine glass. "What's wrong with your current place?" I asked lightly. "It's not about wrong," Isabella said quickly, cutting him off. "It's about moving up. You can't stay stagnant if you want to succeed. Everyone knows environment matters, being around the right people." The right people. The phrase settled heavy between us. I thought of my own neighbors on Oak Street. Retired teachers, young families, a mechanic who always shoveled my walk after a storm. People who waved from their porches, who baked cookies at Christmas. Apparently, they weren't the right kind. The food menus lay unopened in front of us. Isabella, too consumed with her monologue to notice, she launched into talk of her latest networking event, a gala where she'd mingled with council members and donors. "It's exhausting but necessary." She sighed. "You have to present yourself properly at all times. Appearances matter." Her eyes flicked over my dress, lingering on the necklace, and I could feel her measuring, calculating. I straightened my shoulders. "Appearances don't always tell the truth," I said quietly. Daniel cleared his throat quickly, the sound almost desperate. "Mom, how's your week been?" "Keeping busy." His attempt at diversion sounded rehearsed, like a line he had practiced. "I keep myself occupied," I replied, allowing my lips to curve just slightly. "There's always something to do." Isabella leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine with a knowing smirk. "It's important to have hobbies at your stage in life. Keeps the mind sharp." I met her gaze evenly. Yes, hobbies can do that. So can responsibility. For a brief moment, I thought I saw Daniel's eyes flicker with unease. But he said nothing. His silence was louder than her words. The waiter appeared with bread, setting the basket gently on the table. Isabella immediately launched into commentary about gluten, about diets, about how certain choices signaled discipline. Daniel tore off a piece, silently chewing as though he could disappear into the act. I studied him quietly, remembering his 8th birthday when he begged to bring cupcakes for his entire class, insisting no child be left out. That boy had been bold, caring, unwilling to let anyone feel small. The man before me sat mute, nodding to his wife's declarations, choosing complicity over conscience. As Isabella described the custom drapery she'd chosen for their yet unpurchased house, I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of Chardonnay. The crisp taste lingered on my tongue, grounding me in the moment. My son's eyes darted briefly to mine. They were the same eyes that once sparkled as he proudly held a fish beside his father. Now they slid away quickly, filled with hesitation avoidance. And in that fleeting glance I understood. His silence was not neutral. It was a choice. A choice to let me sit on the outside, to let her words define me, to allow the woman who had never sacrificed a thing for him to hold more sway than the mother who gave him everything. I set my glass down gently, the stem clicking against the wood, and folded my hands in my lap. Across from me, Isabella laughed, her voice rising above the music. Daniel leaned toward her, smiling faintly, never once turning back to me. In that moment, the truth pressed down with the weight of certainty. The boy who once promised he would never leave me had grown into a man who had already done so. The plates had just been cleared when Isabella leaned back in her chair, her wineglass turning slowly between her fingers. Her voice carried across the table, cool and precise. "Margaret," she said, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't really fit into our family. Maybe it would be better if you left." The words landed like a slap. For a moment I thought I had misheard her, but the silence that followed confirmed it. The laughter and chatter from surrounding tables dipped, and I felt the shift in the air as people paused, heads turning slightly in our direction. Daniel sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. His hand reached out, covering hers as though in support. My chest tightened at the sight. He didn't look at me. He didn't protest. He didn't say, "That's my mother, show her respect." He just sat there, gripping her hand, his head bowed in a silence that cut deeper than anything Isabella could have said. I swallowed hard, the Chardonnay bitter now on my tongue. I wanted to speak, but for a moment nothing came out. All I could do was stare at the boy I once knew, the boy who once promised never to leave me, and see a man who chose to stay quiet while his wife dismissed me like an unwelcome guest. Isabella's eyes glittered with a satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. She leaned closer to Daniel as if sharing the victory. The candlelight flickered against her face, sharp and cold. Around us, a few diners pretended not to listen, their forks suspended mid-air, conversations stalled. The humiliation spread through me like fire, heating my cheeks, prickling my skin. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Brandon, one of the servers, lingered near the bar with a tray in hand. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second. He knew. They all knew. Every staff member in that room knew who I truly was, what this place meant to me. Yet not one of them moved, not because they didn't care, but because they respected me enough to wait for my lead. I lowered my gaze to my lap, my fingers trembling slightly as I folded them together. The ache inside me sharpened. It wasn't Isabella's cruelty that gutted me. It was Daniel's silence. Silence that screamed louder than any insult. Silence that told me where his loyalties lay. For a breath, I considered doing what I had always done, bowing my head, swallowing the pain, letting the moment pass. I had spent years enduring little jabs, pretending not to notice when Isabella's comments reduced me to something small. I had told myself keeping the peace was more important than speaking the truth. But not tonight. I lifted my head, my spine straightening inch by inch. My eyes swept the room, catching the curious stares that darted away the second I noticed them. Brandon stood rooted near the edge of the dining room, his jaw set, his tray forgotten for the moment. Kira paused at the host stand, her face taut with unease. Even Elias had stepped out from the kitchen, his arms crossed, watching silently. They were all waiting. The silence pressed down thick as fog, but beneath it I felt something stir in me that I hadn't felt in years, a steady pulse of resolve. My humiliation cooled into something harder, sharper. I met Isabella's eyes across the table. For the first time, she seemed unsure, shifting slightly in her chair under the weight of my stare. Daniel finally looked up, his expression tight, but still he said nothing. In that moment, I knew. I would not bow my head again. I reached for my glass of water, steadying myself as I set it back down. My hand didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. I lifted my head and looked past Daniel, past Isabella, to where Raymond stood at the far side of the room. Raymond. I called calm but clear, carrying over the hush that had fallen across the restaurant. Please cancel the check for this table. He was at my side within seconds, his posture respectful, his face unreadable except for the faintest nod of understanding. Of course, Mrs. Collins. I turned back to the two people sitting across from me, both of them staring as if I had suddenly begun speaking another language. There's something you should know, I said evenly. This restaurant, the Maple Oak, belongs to me. I've owned it since 2019. For a moment, everything froze. Isabella's smirk drained away, her lips parting slightly, her eyes wide as though she'd been slapped. Daniel went pale, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling against the tablecloth. Around us, the quiet stretched thin until it snapped. Forks clattered softly onto plates at neighboring tables. The sound of whispers began hesitant at first, then building. A woman in a red scarf leaned toward her companion. A young man in a business suit craned his neck for a better view. Isabella blinked quickly, forcing out a laugh that sounded brittle. This is some kind of joke, right? No joke, I answered, my voice low but firm. I took the insurance money after your father passed and invested it here. I knew this place could succeed if managed properly, and I was right. Daniel's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for words. Mom, why didn't you say anything? I tilted my head. Did you ever ask? The sting of my words seemed to land. He looked down at his hands, silent. Raymond remained beside me, and as if on cue, Brandon appeared from across the room, standing straight, his tray balanced easily. Kira at the host stand folded her hands in front of her and gave me a look full of quiet pride. Mrs. Collins, Raymond said respectfully, would you like me to inform the staff? I nodded once. He turned toward the dining room. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced in a steady voice, this establishment has been under the ownership of Mrs. Margaret Collins for the past 5 years. We are honored to work for her. The ripple was immediate. Diners sat straighter. A couple at the bar lifted their glasses in a subtle toast. One of the kitchen staff poked his head out the swinging door, smiling faintly before disappearing back inside. I felt the weight of eyes on me. Curiosity, surprise, a measure of admiration. But none of it stung the way Isabella's words had. Not anymore. When I looked back at her, she was staring down at her plate cheeks, burning fingers tightening around her napkin as if she could crush the fabric into dust. Her confidence had slipped like a mask ripped away. Daniel shifted in his chair, finally daring to meet my eyes. What I saw there wasn't anger. It was confusion. Maybe shame. But he didn't speak. Not one word. The silence at our table grew so heavy I could almost hear the beat of my own heart. And then as the whispers in the dining room swelled into a low current of voices, I sat back and folded my hands neatly in my lap. For the first time all evening, it was Isabella, who couldn't bear the weight of the moment. She kept her eyes down her proud posture, crumbling inch by inch until she was left staring at the linen napkin in her lap like a chastened child. The restaurant, my restaurant, filled with the murmur of strangers. But for me, it was the quiet between the murmurs, the few seconds of stunned stillness before the noise rose that rang the loudest. Daniel's voice was barely audible. His shoulders hunched as though the words themselves weighed him down. Mom, why didn't you tell me I just wanted what was best for you? I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. "And when did you ever ask what my life was really like? Did you ever wonder how I spent my days? Or were you too busy assuming I needed saving?" His mouth opened, then shut again. He had no answer. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood. Slowly, I rose my hands, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said evenly. Then I turned and walked away. The hum of the restaurant returned as I crossed the dining room heels, clicking softly against the floor. I felt dozens of eyes on me, but I didn't lower my head. Not this time. The staff parted slightly to let me pass. Brandon gave me the faintest nod, and Kira's hand brushed against mine as if to say, "We saw you, we're with you." Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair and hurried footsteps. "Mom, wait." Daniel's voice was tight, rushed. I didn't stop until I stepped outside into the crisp night air. The cold wrapped around me, biting at my skin, but it was cleaner than the suffocating air I'd left behind. Daniel caught up his breath, clouding in the light spilling from the windows. "Please, just listen." I kept walking, the rhythm of my heels steady against the pavement. He hovered at my side, his words tumbling out and faltering. "I didn't mean for her to say that. I should have stopped her. His voice cracked, then broke into silence. I let him stumble, let him taste the weight of his own hesitation. We moved through the quiet streets, past darkened shops and shuttered cafes, the city muffled in winter's stillness. Twice he started to speak again, his mouth forming words that never made it past his throat. Each time I kept my eyes ahead, my hands tucked into the folds of my coat. The walk felt both endless and too short, each step carrying me closer to the house that Robert and I had built, closer to the solitude that was somehow safer than this fractured attempt at reconciliation. When we reached my front steps, I finally stopped. I turned the porch light, casting a pale glow across us both. He looked younger in that moment, almost boyish, his face pale and uncertain. The sight twisted something deep in me, but not enough to undo what had been said, what had been left unsaid for years. "Go home, Daniel," I said softly. But my tone left no room for argument. "Your wife is waiting." He froze, his weight shifting from one foot to the other as if torn between staying and retreating, his lips parted, eyes glistening with something I couldn't name. But in the end he nodded, faintly, turned, and walked back into the darkness. I watched until his figure dissolved into the night, then opened my door and stepped inside, the click of the lock echoing in the stillness of my empty house. 6 months passed, and Maple Oak thrived in ways I once only dreamed of. The dining room filled most nights' reservations booked weeks in advance, and the hum of voices carried out onto the street like music. Local Kitchen magazine ran a feature on us, complete with glossy photos of Elias in his whites and Raymond surveying the dining room with his clipboard. They called Maple Oak a hidden gem resurrected by steady hands and vision. They didn't mention my name, and that was fine. Those who needed to know already knew. I found myself moving through each day with a lightness that had been absent for years. My mornings began not with heavy silence, but with purpose. Supplier meetings, staff check-ins, phone calls with vendors. Afternoons might bring quiet hours in my office or a walk through the bustling streets of downtown Columbus. Evenings belonged to Maple Oak's glow, where I often drifted table to table with a kind word, or simply sat back and watched strangers feel at home under the roof I had saved. Donald became a constant presence in my life, not in a dramatic way, but steady, reliable. We went to art exhibits at the museum, sat side by side in the library, listening to poetry readings, wandered through the used bookshop he loved as if it were a cathedral. He had an ease about him that softened my edges, his humor gentle, his patience steady. One evening as we left a small gallery showing, he slipped his hand lightly over mine. Not a claim, not a question, just a quiet gesture of companionship. For the first time since Robert, I didn't pull away. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat near the window in my office, looking out at the sidewalk, when I noticed a familiar figure outside with her phone pressed to her ear. Isabella. Even from a distance, her impatience was obvious. The sharp movements of her hands, the way her heels tapped against the pavement. A few minutes later, Raymond knocked gently before stepping in. "Mrs. Collins," he said, lowering his voice, though I could see the glint in his eyes. "We just received a call from City Hall. They wanted a last-minute reservation for a party of 8 this Friday. We're already full." "Who placed the call?" I asked, though I already knew. "Mrs. Isabella Collins." The name sat between us for a moment, heavier than it should have been. I lifted my pen, set it back down, and I told her we couldn't accommodate. Policy is policy, no special treatment. I exhaled slowly, letting the air carry away more than just breath. "Good. Thank you, Raymond." Through the glass I saw her again, still pacing outside. The phone pressed to her ear, her head shaking sharply, her voice rising though I couldn't hear the words. She was not used to hearing no, not used to being turned away. For a moment our eyes met through the pain and she froze, her expression caught between surprise and indignation. She turned sharply on her heel, her coat whipping behind her as she stalked off down the street. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel triumph or spite. What I felt instead was release. A loosening inside me, as if a knot that had sat tight in my chest for years had finally begun to unravel. Watching her walk away, stripped of the power she thought she held, I realized I didn't need retribution. The balance had restored itself without my hand. That evening, I walked the dining room, slowly stopping to greet a couple celebrating their anniversary, a family of 4 laughing over dessert. The hum of life filled the space, warm and steady. I caught Elias's eye from the kitchen pass. He gave me a quick nod, flour streaked across his cheek. Kira waved from the hostess stand, juggling calls and walk-ins. Brandon carried a tray balanced high, his grin easy even under pressure. They were my family now in all the ways that mattered. I paused near the window, looking out at the street where only a few hours earlier Isabella had stood, demanding what could never again be hers to control. I caught my reflection in the glass. Silver hair, neat shoulders squared, eyes calm. For the first time in a long while, I saw myself not as someone waiting for scraps of love or recognition, but as a woman who had built her own peace. I smiled faintly, not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in quiet acceptance. For the first time, I truly felt free. I no longer measured my days by what Daniel said or didn't say. The ache of a mother's disappointment never truly disappears, but over time it dulled into something quieter, something I could live with. I still loved him. Nothing could erase that, but I no longer let his silence or Isabella's scorn dictate the worth of my life. Love did not mean surrendering myself to humiliation. In the spring of 2023, I had walked into my lawyer's office and updated my will. The decision had weighed heavily on me, but clarity came when I read the draft aloud. My estate, including Maple Oak, would pass to Daniel only if he could demonstrate respect and care toward me in my lifetime. If not, it would go to causes that mattered to me. The public library scholarships for young culinary students like Elias once was, and a portion for the staff who had become my chosen family. Writing those words didn't feel cruel. It felt necessary. A boundary drawn after too many years of compromise. Sometimes I still thought of Daniel as the boy who promised "I'll never leave you, Mom." I allowed myself to miss that boy, but I no longer clung to the hope that the man would return. Instead, I focused on the life I had now, the one I had built in the quiet absence of his care. One Friday evening, I stood at the entrance of Maple Oak as the dinner rush swelled. The dining room glowed with laughter and the clink of glasses. Families leaned in close, couples toasted milestones, friends shared plates of ravioli and roasted chicken. It was everything I had envisioned when I bought this place and more. I walked slowly along the aisle, greeting a few regulars, pausing by the bar to thank Brandon for his grace under pressure, giving Kira a smile as she juggled 2 phone calls at once. Raymond caught my eye from across the room, tapping his notepad and nodding his silent way of telling me everything was running smoothly. Elias peeked from the kitchen pass, a fresh dish in hand. his grin quick and proud. They were all part of this family. I had found a family no one could take from me. As I turned back toward the door, it opened, and Donald stepped inside. He carried that quiet warmth with him, the kind that softened even the hardest day. His scarf was tucked neatly under his coat, his hands full of books he must have just picked up from his store. "Margaret," he said with that familiar smile, "you look like you belong here more than anyone else." I laughed softly, surprised by how true it felt. Maybe I finally do. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I thought I'd stop by, see if you had time for tea after the rush." Of course, I said, touched by how natural it had become for him to weave into my evenings. As the door closed behind him, I looked around the restaurant once more. For years, I had chased after scraps of love, after recognition from those who could not give it. Now I saw it clearly. My worth had never depended on them. It lived here in the laughter of strangers who felt at home under my roof, in the respect of colleagues who believed in me, and in the steady presence of a man who saw me for who I was, not who I failed to be for someone else. I stood a little taller, the sapphire at my neck catching the light, and breathed in the sounds of maple oak alive and thriving. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. And perhaps many who hear my story have felt the sting of being hurt by their own family. But what matters most is not the wound they leave. It is the peace we find for ourselves after. That peace is what I hold on to now. Tell me, have you found yours?